So, welcome. I'll show you today the double loop of test-driven development with a outside-in approach, and we're using technologies like Wicket, Scala, ScalaTest and ScalaMock. We will develop a small web application based on Wicket, and it has a login page and a registration page. So you basically can only log into the web application when you have registered before. So we have to implement both those things, registration and login. And the double loop is basically really a double loop. You have an outer loop and you have an inner loop, and the outer loop is the acceptance tests, and the inner loop are the unit tests. So what I have prepared is a simple application launcher, which basically just sets up a Wicket, a Jetty server, and with a Wicket servlet filter, and yeah, that's about it. So the application launcher will be used in the integration tests setup or acceptance test setup. Here where we say before all I want to start the application, and after all I want to stop the application, and in between we set up a Selenium driver for each test, and yeah, what else? We have the feature spec style of ScalaTest with given when then, and I can show you how that looks like. Let me open up this registration test, acceptance test, registration acceptance test. And so the feature spec gives us this feature scenario stuff here, and the given when then is basically just to separate within the test, right? So yeah. So but we start with the acceptance tests, right? So I have a feature user registration with two scenarios. I have one scenario is a new user registers, and the second scenario is an existing user registers, and both have different outcomes. So for example, the second one requires that a user has registered before, and yeah. And yeah, so we have to work our way through all the details down the road. Now, as a first thing, let me run this acceptance test here, and then we'll basically see where it fails. And it fails with a here where we expect a certain page title, but instead we found error 404 not found. And that's natural because we haven't we did not implement anything of the application, so it's natural that this fails. So we have to start implementing our features now. So the first thing we have to do is to mount a registration page. But let me go back to here. But what we have done in the acceptance test is to already, yeah, we already have defined where this page, the page path basically. If we go here to start registration page, we will see that we have to have an URL of /register, or it's the path of the URL, and that is what we have to implement, right? So let's go back here and let's mount a new page. Mount page, and here we have to use this path register. Right, so we need a page backing class of registration page. Now this class doesn't exist, so we have to create it, right? And to make this compile. So let me create a registration page. And usually you would inherit from Wicket web page, but I have created a base page which does some convenience things for us, but it requires us to implement two things. That is the page title, and we have to implement the form components here in this initialize form. But we don't touch this any further now. I just added this to make this compile, and then we can close this here again. We can also close the acceptance test. So what we do next is we create a test class for this page. We call it registration page should. And we extend from base Scala test. That's also a convenience class. It only sets up the JUnit4 runner. That's all it does. And we use a style of word spec like, because then we can say we have a typo here. Registration page should. We can say that registration page should create and render. And here we need to have, we want to create the page now and see whether we have a working test environment. And we do that using the Wicket tester. We have no tester yet, so we have to create that start page. But I know how this is going to work. So let me just write this: start page, new registration page. Right. So we need our tester, private var tester. Wicket tester. Then I want to set up this tester for each test from scratch, before and after. Oh, I forgot to start my Pomodoro. Let me do that quickly. Tester equals new Wicket tester, and we can give it our application new UI demo Wicket application. Right. So we have now our tester, and we can assert rendered page. Rendered page should be the registration page. Now let's run this test and see. fails. Implementation is missing. So yeah, get page title. Right, so we have to implement, let me do one thing. I want to split this. Yep. We don't need that. I want to have the test here and the implementation on the other side. So yeah, so we have to implement something here. And to make it pass, I just implement it quickly, just empty, and run the test again. Still fails. Let's see, still an implementation missing, initialize form. Alright, so we just implemented empty. And run the test again. And now it passes. Okay, good. So, but there's nothing more. Well, actually, yeah. So we have now just an empty page. This is just an empty page that got rendered now. But we want to have some form. We have some form components on this page for sure. So we have a login, a username. We have a password, and we have some about string. Yeah. So I have prepared the HTML part of this. Which is basically, yeah, let me comment this in now because we need this now. And I would usually go probably slower and add one component after the other and create a test for each and you know, triangulation. But since I know what we have to do here, I will skip a few steps, right? But what we need to have, this is a simple form and even table-based because I'm not into cascading style sheets, so please bear with me. So we have a username, we have a password, and we have an about. And also we have a register button, and we have a feedback panel here, a Wicket feedback panel where we can show form errors or some other kind of errors that that can pop up, right? So good, yeah. Let's go back to our test, and I have added or commented in those form fields now. And when we run the test again, it will probably fail because we have no accompanying. We have, yeah. So Wicket complains that it can't find form username and all those components. So so we have to add those components on the page now in order to make this test pass. So let me do that. We have to add those components to the form. So add new text field. This was for the username, so we have a string type, and the Wicket ID is username. We have a form component, new password, text field. It has the Wicket ID of password, and we can also say here, let me add that this is required. So this component is required. A password text field is also required. And we have a form component for the about text. which is not required, so we don't set required to true. And we have a button. And the button is called register button. Right. And we also have the feedback panel. Let me add the feedback panel at the top. Even though it's on the last position here, but as long as it's in the same hierarchy, Wicket doesn't care if you add it in which position, in which, what is the sequence. Feedback. Okay. So let's run the test again here. See what we get. And it passes. Good. So is there anything we can refactor here? No, not really. No. No. So create and render. I think this test case is now complete. We can create the page and we can render it with all the components. So let's create a new test. So registration page should register a user, a new user in. So let me copy from here. We have to start the page. I don't want to assert that the page has been rendered because that's part of this test there. But yeah, what do we do here? So we can assume that when we submit, when we click this register button and the form submits, that that those form fields are delivered to some API. I think I would like to call this registration API, and this registration API, I want to create a user with this registration data. So yeah, so I want to call this, where's this registration data in? So we need some data transfer object or some model object where we put this data in, and let me call this registration data. And when we submit the page, this registration data should be filled with a username, a password, and an about. And does it return something? When all is good, I don't actually want to return something because the registration, yeah, I don't know. It doesn't care, right? So we return nothing. When something goes wrong, we probably want to, I want to have that an exception is thrown. Yeah. So for example, when the user exists already, then I want to have an exception thrown. But we have to make a few things green here now. We don't have registration data, or let me first add the registration API. So we start mocking now. Let me put this a little bit to the side here. We start mocking now. So we have to add our mock factory. And we have our registration API, which is of type, which is an interface registration API. And before each test, I want this to be set up. Mock I registration API. So this registration interface doesn't exist yet. So we'll have to create an interface. Let me create an interface here. Okay. Then we have this screen. It doesn't know the create user. So let me add this create user method, def create user with registration data. And it returns nothing. But it, not yet. We're not going too far. Yeah, so this is screen 2. We have to add registration data. I would assume that registration data is a model of the API. I don't want to put this in any domain, so let me create a sub-package here. Model, where we put the registration data. And it's a simple class. We use a case class, a Scala case class, and we have username, password, and about. Yeah, that's it. This should make this a little bit more happy, and it should make this a little bit happy. We can close this. So now we just need to add our username. Let me add a value. Manfred is the username. The password is some password, because it doesn't matter at all. And the about is about Manfred. Okay, so we have, it compiles. This is good. It compiles. Yeah, let's run the test. Oh, this was only the first test, so let me run all tests basically. Okay, so the second test fails because we have an expectation, a mock expectation, unsatisfied expectation, and we are expecting that a create user method is called, but there's none called. Yeah, that's correct, because we don't call it. So we have to call the create user. We have to call the create user method on this API. So let's see. When do we want to call this create user? we want to call it when the button is clicked on submit. So when we submit this form, we want to call this create user method. Now, okay, so now I could do this new registration API dot create user. So let me quickly implement a registration API, concrete class, to make this compile, extends registration API, create user. And I want to implement this empty. So that's all right. Yeah, what do we do here? So we need some model. In Wicket, this usually works the following way. You set up a model for this component. Set default model. New, I want a compound property model of type registration data. And now I need some object. I use an instance object, registration data, which does not exist yet, but let me add that. Private var, maybe we can use a val equals new registration data with empty, and since this is a case class, we don't need a new operator. Okay, so oops, what did I do? So okay, so this is okay. Now we can put this registration data into this method, and that is good. But yeah, what do we do here? We're creating a hard coupling, right? So we don't want to use hard couplings because we basically cannot test this, right? So I can create tests what I want. As long as we're not able to insert or to inject a mock version of this registration API, I cannot test it. So what we do here is there are a couple of options. We could inject this collaborator on the constructor of the page, but and that would be preferable, I would say. But for Wicket creates this page for us. So usually Wicket instantiates this class for us, and in Wicket you have only two options. Either you use dependency injection using GOOS, Google GOOS or something, or we can use a factory method here. And I would do the factory method because it's a little bit simpler for this simple example case here. So so let me create a new registration API factory method. And on the normal case is that it just creates just a new instance of this registration API. But in the onSubmit handler, I use this factory method, right? So so let me see. Let's run the test and see what we're getting. I think there's still a lot of things we have to do in order to make this pass. So first of all, yeah, we still have this unsatisfied expectation, which is clear because when we use it here as is, it will still instantiate this new registration API. But we want to use our mock. So what we have to do is to override this this factory method, and inject our mock. Yes, good. Let's run the test again. Okay, there's still an error. Still unsatisfied. Expected once but never called. Yes, I think I know why. Because we have to, because some form fields are empty, right? So we have to add form fields, otherwise Wicket will not call this submit handler. It will bail out earlier. So let's set up some form fields. Let's insert some form fields. New form tester. The path is form tester. Set value form ID username. We want our username to be added. Form tester set value password. We want our password to be added. About. And we actually also need to submit. We need to hit the registration button, right? So we need to submit and give it the registration button. So let's run the test again. And it still fails. Okay, so there's no registration button. It's called register button. Still fails. Why? Yeah. Right. So we have to set up our expectation before. Okay, the Pomodoro ended. Let me start a new one. So we have to set up the expectation before we actually do the submit. And it's green. Cool. Okay, it's green. So what have we done? We have created a page. We expect that our registration API collaborator, or the create user method of the collaborator, is called with a registration data of username, password, and about. And those fields must have the value of those fields, basically the same fields that we have set in the form. Otherwise, our expectation would also fail. I think that is okay. Yeah. Okay. So let me run the integration to the acceptance test and see what we're getting. So it complains that the expected page title is this, but in fact we're getting this. Okay, so we can fix this quickly by going to the registration page and setting the page title to this. Now let's run this again. But it still fails. So there are a few things that, so we have in the acceptance test, in this scenario, in this scenario where we register a new user, we expect that when the user was created, that we return to the login page, right? And that's not what we do. So we are not returning to any login page. So we can try doing that actually, and that would be an additional test, or it would actually be an additional assertion here. Tester.assert rendered page is class of login page. Now the login page doesn't exist, so we have to create a login page, just an empty one to make this compile. Login page. But we must extend it from the base page, which requires us to implement those things here. But it will make this compile, and we can run our test again. Oh no, I'm still running the integration test. I don't want that. I want to run those tests, or those unit tests. Yeah, and then the test fails because it expects a login page, but it's still the registration page that was rendered. And that is because we must set a different response page. Here. Right. Let's run the test. Okay, and it passes. Great. let's run the acceptance test again. And it still fails. Okay, I think we can do that. We're not setting the login page title. And it passes. Yeah. So we can actually move on to the second scenario where we inject a user and then want to see errors on the page. Yeah, and this fails because unable to locate feedback. No such element. So there's no, we assert a certain feedback that the user already exists, but there's no feedback on this page. That is probably because we don't let create user fail if a user has already been registered. So I think I think we should do that now. Wait a second, where are we? What do we have to do? So the create user method should throw an exception when the user already exists. And I think the next thing we have to do is actually yeah, actually I would create registration page should. I would extend my test cases here to the scenario. Register a new user. Registration page should fail, should set fail and should fail and set feedback when the user already exists. Okay. So we do the same here. We set up our registration API, but we have a different expectation. So our expectation is that when the user, no, Yeah, when the user exists, then throws new exception. User already exists. Yeah. So let me also set up the form fields. And basically what we also can assert is that well, when this exception is thrown, that we are A, still on the registration page, and that get feedback messages null. What does this return? A list of feedback messages contains I want to check that it contains our exception message. I think we have to yeah, let me Scala dot exists. Let me import the Scala collection utilities. Exists is warning get message equals our user, our exception message. Right. Let's run those tests. So this fails. Exception already exists. So it throws this exception. Yeah, it just throws this exception. But we do not have the feedback, right? So I think what we have to do is we have to catch this exception. And set it as error on the page. Try that. Yep, and it passes. Okay, good. Okay, so let me run the integration test again. It should still fail. It should still fail. Because we're still using only mocks. There's no real implementation yet involved. And yes, and certainly, so there's no feedback on this page because there's actually nothing that throws an exception because the registration API handler here, this create user, is completely empty. So it just does nothing, right? So what we have to do now is actually to creative tests. So now we test the registration API. We have to make sure that that it works correctly. So that's where we should continue. I think the registration page is okay now. Let me close this. And we'll continue implementing a test for the registration API. Registration API should word spec like registration API should create a user if it doesn't exist. Or no, let me start create a user. So we have our API. We have our API. What do we expect? What do we expect the registration API to do when it creates a user? I think we have to go, we have to introduce a repository where the users are actually stored, right? And I don't want to store them in the registration API. So there must be another layer, which I call it user repository. And user repository, I don't want to call it create user because I want to call it add user. And it expects a user which doesn't exist yet, a user which has a username and a password and then about. And then returns. It returns maybe the user is maybe something must be done with the user after it was added, so we just return the same user back. So that's something we could do. Yeah. Returns, yeah, basically I want to return this, right? Well, user or a new user expects new user, returns new user. So we have nothing of this, so let's with mock factory private var user repository is of type iUser repository with before and after. I want to set up the user repository as a mock. Let me create this repository. We create this now in the domain. Yeah. Now we don't have a user yet. So let me create, no, not a Java class. I want a Scala class called user. And basically also has a username, password, and some about. Nothing fancy. Let me create the username. Oops. Now the repository doesn't know the addUser method yet, so let me create this. Def addUser. User. Return the same user. In case something doesn't work, I want to throw an exception. Okay. Let me run this test, see what we get. Oh, okay, so there's, yeah, this certainly doesn't work yet. An expectation, but nothing is done. So we have to call the create user with registration data. And the registration data is basically the same as what we have done here, the same data of the user. Okay, it still does not do anything, that's clear. Let me split the screen. Because it doesn't do anything, right? So what we have to do in here is basically now the question is, we basically here we have to map our registration data to a user. But we also have to, okay, this was my second Pomodoro. I just go on. I just continue. We have to use the repository. So how do we get the repository here? How do we get the repository here? We could inject it via the constructor, or we can create a factory method. But actually, I want the repository to be replaceable with something else, because we implement here now a simple repository based on a hash map, I guess. And I want the repository to be replaceable. So how do we make it replaceable? Either dependency injection, or in my case, I want to use an abstract factory. So basically I want to say here, user repository factory, which is basically just a static context, right? Where get. And here I want to call the addUser method with our rec data. So let me create the user repository factory. Let me put it in here. So I have already some pre-created class abstract factory, it's called, which is a generic type of factory, and user repository factory. And I wanted to extend from abstract factory the type I user repository. Okay, so what we can't do, we can't put the registration data in here because the addUser method requests or only accepts a user and not registration data. So what we do is create an object with an implicit converter, implicit rec data to user. We want our user, and what we do here is user registration data dot username registration data dot password registration data dot about. Yep, implicit. When we import this here, no, I have a typo here. Then this will work because it will implicitly convert my registration data to a user. So, yeah. Good. Let's run the test. Set an instance first. Right, so this abstract factory is uninitialized. It's not initialized, so we have to initialize with something before we use it. User repository factory init with, init from user repository, and after we want to clean it, because this is a This is a static context, and I don't want to interfere it with other tests. And it passes. Good. So whatever use, what other use cases do we have here? A repository, a registration API should throw an exception when the user to be created already exists. So we have our registration API. Then I want my user, and I want to actually I want yeah, so what we do is, no, I want to yeah, so we call the create user on the API with registration data, so we can copy this here. But the expectation is a different one. When the create user method is called, I want it to first check by calling the user repository, does user exist with username? It expects a username and then throws new exception user already exists. No, I don't want to throw it. No. This is just a simple return. Returns. I want that it returns true. So when the user exists with this username, I want it to return true. But we have to extend the interface. Does user exist with username? Right. Let's run the test. Unexpected call at user. So we're expecting this method to be called, but in fact the at user is called. So we have to here check first. Let me do it like this. Repo, user repo. If user repo does user exist with username, reg data username, then yeah, actually I should throw an exception here, right? So that's what we expect. Should throw an exception. So we let us. So I have missed the expectation here. Enter. So let me catch it. Caught. Intercept. We want to intercept an exception. And we want to assert that caught get message equals user already exists. Alright, so then I have to throw this exception with user on exists, and otherwise I will add the user. Yeah. Now the first one fails because so we have this, we call this for the on a normal crate, call this 2, but here I want to say false because the user doesn't exist. Okay, and they both are okay. So I think that's pretty much for it for the registration API. I think that's pretty much it for the registration API. Let me close this stuff here. And let's run the registration test again. See if we're getting there. Feature scenario. Oh, set an instance first. Right. Okay. So the abstract factory certainly, yeah, so this is the real code, and we have to set up this this factory, and I think I would do it in the init method of the Wicket application. So user repository dot init with new user repository. Now this new, or no, let me call it new hash map user repository. Because we want to use a hash map based user repository here. So, but this doesn't exist. And I guess we have to implement this, because otherwise it won't even compile. So let me copy the name of this, close this, and let me create a test for hashmap user repository should. Word spec like. Hashmap user repository should create new hash map user repository. And since this doesn't exist, I have to created. This extends iUser repository, so which makes us implement some methods, right? Good. Let me split the screen again so we can implement our tests. So this should repository. Do I have a typo here? New hashmap user repository. Hashmap user repository. I have a typo. So let me run this here. What is this? Yep. Okay, so this compiles. Okay, this is green. Should be able to add a user. Repo add user. Manfred. For return. Assert that A it returns, and actually it should return the same what we have put in. Let me run this. It certainly doesn't work. Implementation is missing. Wait a moment. Shouldn't this return something? Yeah, it should return user. So why is Scala just not able to set this right? So we basically return the user. And that passes. The next test would be should be able to check if a user already exists. So we have our repo, we have our we add a user, and then does user exist? Add username, and it should return true. This returns Boolean. Yeah, simplify this. Let's run the test. annotation is missing. I want to return false because I want to see the test fail. It was false. Now let me make it green. It's green, but we don't store it yet, right? So we have to store it someplace. So we are in the yellow phase for refactoring, and we make it proper now. We use a val user map. It's a hash map, java.util.hashmap with key is a string and value is a user. New hash map, new java util dot hash map string user. Okay, so we basically check here user map contains key username. Let's run the test. It fails. It was false because we actually do not add a user. So user map dot put user dot username comma user. Expected what? Yeah, right. Yeah, so we can still return the user. And they are all green. So that's good. What about this here? Do we need a return value? No, we don't check the return value. There's a typo as well. Repository. Yeah, okay. So I think that's it, what we need for the repository now. I think that's what we need for the repository now. Let's close those files and run our integration test or acceptance test again to see what we are getting now. And they are both passing. Okay, so we see the feedback on the page, which is great. Okay, and our third Pomodoro, just in time. This is very good. Okay, so that was it for the registration. And the next session will be to implement the login. I expect the login to be a little bit faster because we have now laid out basically much of the architecture, and I expect the login to be a little bit faster. Okay, so but that's it for now. See you next time.